You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
Hello and welcome to ADHD BCE, the podcast foraging through space and time to uncover the many positive ways neurodiversity has impacted the human story. From our earliest ancestors, neurodiversity has helped shape the world we live in, and on this show, we're going to be diving into some of the most enigmatic and significant events, places, and people that have driven humanity from simple tree dwellers to space-travelling entrepreneurs. I'm your late-diagnosed neurodivergent host, George Lomas, and I'll be interviewing archaeologists, academics, and neurodiversity specialists in this quest to prove that being on the spectrum is something we can be very proud of. So let's make like ADHD and jump right in. So welcome everyone to episode 14, and today we're going back to ancient Britain to meet the greatest rebel you've probably never heard of, the semi-mythical Caratacus. Now, when we think of Celtic resistance against Rome, the name that normally comes to mind is Boudica, but a decade before her famous revolt, Caratacus led a fierce guerrilla campaign against the Roman Empire that lasted almost 10 years. Despite being outnumbered, outgunned, and eventually betrayed, he refused to submit, not even when he was paraded in chains through the streets of Rome. In fact, his defiance was so impressive that the Romans, unusually for them, decided to let him live. And here's where things get a little interesting. Ancient sources, I think mostly from Tacitus, describe Caratacus as stubborn, charismatic, and unpredictable. He adapted quickly, thought outside the box, and refused to conform to Roman expectations. Sound familiar? Well, today we're going to explore whether Caratacus may have displayed neurodivergent traits, despite Roman attempts to make him mask them. And to help us break that down, I'm once again joined by fabulous physiotherapist. You're not a physiotherapist, are you, Kathy?
Absolutely not.
I'm joined by fabulous psychotherapist and ADHD specialist, Kathy Charlton. Kathy, welcome back.
Hello. Yeah, definitely not physio.
Yeah, okay. I think you could probably do that as well. You're a talented person.
I'm going to say no.
No, fair enough. Okie dokie. Well, anyway, so who was Caratacus? So Caratacus was a Celtic war leader, most likely born around the turn of the 1st century AD. He was the son of another wonderfully Celtic name, Cunobelinus, the powerful king of the Catavalini tribe, a tribe that was based in what is now south-east England. And when the Romans invaded Britain in 43 AD, Caratacus and his brother Togodumnus, I think his name was, were the first to stand against them. But Rome wasn't here to play around. Emperor Claudius sent a massive force, 4 legions in fact, around 40,000 professional soldiers, plus cavalry, auxiliaries, and of course war elephants, because why wouldn't you? The Brits, they were sort of the British the Celtic tribes, like most Celtic tribes, they like to fight each other, but when push came to shove, they'd fight the outsider together. So the Brits, they fought back, but typically the Romans steamrolled their way inland, was killed in battle, and Caratacus fled westward. But instead of surrendering, he did something quite remarkable. Caratacus took refuge in Wales among the fiercely independent tribes there. I'll try and pronounce them. There's a couple of tribes called the Silures and Ordivices, and I've probably got them both wrong, so apologies for that. Now, these tribes weren't natural allies of the Catavalini, but Caratacus had a rare skill. He could inspire loyalty, and he could unite people against a common enemy. Kathy, do you see any neurodivergence coming out already there?
Well, he's, as you say, he's kind of to inspire loyalty and unite people. So he's a natural leader.
Yeah.
I suppose quite happy to stand up as well, isn't he? So kind of, what do they say? Kind of putting your head above the parapet. But also, you've got to use quite a lot of things like charm, charisma, persuasiveness. They're all like the favourite superpowers, I would say, that you often see within ADHD.
Yeah, sure. And I suppose he would have had to display quite a lot of authenticity there as well. Yeah. People would see through him if he was afraid or if he was doing it for personal gain, but he's doing it for a common cause, isn't he?
I suppose, yeah, because you're talking about how they weren't naturally allies, but at that time, I suppose there had to be trust, some kind of allegiance built. So it felt like they were actually all on the same side. But do you actually recognise that, George, how kind of building allegiance with fellow people when you have to stand up against a common enemy?
Yeah, absolutely. It's that inspiration to do it in the first place. What are you going to lose? Is it just wealth? Is it just status? Are you losing your home? Are you losing your way of life? Because the Roman imperial war machine was incredibly dogmatic. It basically steamrolled any other culture. They rewarded the chiefs or the nobility for allying with Rome's expectations, but they also suppressed a lot of their cultural heritage.
Yeah, I suppose not wanting to lose,
your identity.
Yeah, absolutely, your identity and that kind of right from wrong. But I just wonder how much the Romans were expecting there was going to be a problem, because they sent a massive force. So there was obviously some kind of, the story had gone before them, so they already potentially were known as going to be trouble, that it wasn't going to be a walkover.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, you go back more than a century where Rome had been in Europe, the Germanic tribes and the Gauls and so on, and trying to assimilate them into the empire. And the Brits had been supplying European Celts to help them in their warfare and going over and fighting. So Rome fully expected Celtic resistance, absolutely.
Okay.
So let's keep going with Caratacus. So he went over to Wales and then he sort of initiated what is basically guerrilla warfare. And this, unusually, he was very successful with it, to be honest. He carried on with this for the best part of a decade. Unlike traditional Celtic war leaders who preferred open battle, and bearing in mind that the Celts used to like to paint themselves up and tattoo themselves up and shave themselves, leaving just the moustache, and they'd fight naked in front of the gods. There was no unity. They're very different styles. Rome was very rigid and war, as you imagine modern warfare to be. The Celts were very much, you were there, the gods were watching you, you were showing off to the gods. So it was all about individual performances. So they didn't line up in particular shapes or anything like that. They literally just all turned up and went flying in, pretty much. This is important, really, because instead of using sort of that open battle, Caratacus fought sort of what you probably would call asymmetrically. So he used to use hit and run tactics and ambushes, and he'd use knowledge of the local terrain to harass the Roman supply chains, disrupting any attempts to take over. And I don't know, does this sort of suggest a tactical creativity and adaptability that could be associated with neurodivergent thinking?
So you said that he broke the mold. He wasn't actually doing the traditional. I wonder if part of that was obviously that he'd been pushed back quite a bit already. So maybe the traditional way of fighting wasn't necessarily, he'd already established that wasn't going to work. But I suppose rather than just being dogged and sticking to that line of thought, it sounds like it's sort of thinking outside the box, kind of being more creative about things, quite a big thinker, using kind of clever gameplay. I suppose kind of really catching the Romans off guard, it sounds like. That was almost got like a bit of a cheekiness to it, thinking, he suddenly kind of ambushed who were seen as this formidable fighting machine, which were the Romans, and he's kind of undermining them, which makes me smile. The idea of that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, I get that. I feel the same way. He's whoever he was a special guy, so an inspirational character, definitely. Obviously, at the time, this would have infuriated the Romans, the fact that they couldn't pin him down. And I know the Roman governor, Scapula, became obsessed with capturing him. The Scapula was basically terrorizing the area, destroying strongholds, and executed any sort of suspected sympathizers. And he eventually forced Caratacus into a last stand. And I think at this point, we're just going to take a quick early break and then come back with what happened next with Caratacus. Okay, so now we get to what we call, what I'm calling the last stand, which was around 51 AD. Scapula had pinned Caratacus down in, I think, they're not quite sure what the location is, but I think it's sort of modern-day Shropshire into Wales, around that sort of area. But typically, Caratacus thought outside the box. He chose his battlefield very carefully, which it was supposed to be a hill fort, which was surrounded by steep slopes and riverbanks. And I think that's all. The thought there is forethought. Sorry, there is stopping the Roman war machine. And he fortified the position, so he lined the hills with warriors. And obviously having to give a rousing speech to his troops, urging them to fight for their freedom. So, yeah, I mean, obviously the Romans were masters of siege warfare. So, according to history, they formed their infamous testudo, which is the tortoise formation, where they put all the shields above their heads and they marched up the slopes, and eventually they overran the defences there. And although Caratacus's warriors fought bravely, they were eventually no match for Roman discipline, which is a theme that runs throughout any sort of Roman Celtic warfare. So unfortunately for Caratacus, the battle was lost. This is the point where Caratacus he's inspired all these warriors to follow him and to fight in unusual ways and to employ all these tactics.
He's not giving up, is he? I mean,
no.
Actually, time after time, he keeps getting back up again. He's fighting for his home, isn't he? He's fighting for his way of life, and there's a lot more to it. But just to have that ability to just keep getting back up again.
Would you call that resilience?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, but also, as a lot of people potentially would say, oh, come on, let's be kind of, level-headed about this, and let's be thinking, right, surely, we need to start working with these people rather than just keep fighting them. But he didn't. He wanted, so is it, forgive my language, but a bit of bloody mindedness, really, potentially.
Absolutely. That's something that I see in neurodivergence in my own family. Once your mind's made up, if you believe in something, there's a lot of things that, what I call it in my family, that autistic loyalty. And that sort of bloody mindedness.
Are you talking kind of determination?
Yeah, I suppose so.
Despite everything, it's still not okay, and I'm still going to keep.
Yeah, just a sensitivity as well there, because the Romans are, as the Celts in Britain were at the time, were very aware, had massacred many Iron Age people in Europe, and had enforced their imperialist movement on them. And the taxes and the forced acceptance of Roman ways, it would have been stifling to what were, I think, in the Iron Age Celts, that sort of, they were very fierce, natural, wild people. The tribes fought amongst themselves. They were individuals as well as a community. It was completely different. So it's almost as though Caratacus and his followers saw Rome as something so different that there is no way they were ever going to assimilate or to accept their way. Yeah.
But I suppose, as much as we applaud the Romans for some of the things that we have got, with
the roads.
But I wonder if that felt too restrictive, too particular, that you have to do certain things in certain ways. The culture was a lot more about people like nobility, wasn't it? Things like that. Whereas I don't hear that from the Celtics. I mean, obviously there would have been people in leadership roles, but it was on a much kind of more in touch with the land, more in touch with, community basis from what I can understand. But the Romans, it was kind of remote rule, wasn't it? It was all being done from people very far away who really didn't have much to do with or can have much connection with the land they were governing, so it must have felt really quite stifling, like you said, so unfair. I mean, who are you to just suddenly rock up and tell us how to live?
You sound like a Celt. Yeah, no, I see that. So, so Caratacus at the fort, instead of he refused to be captured. So he managed to escape and he fled to sort of northern England, to the Brigantes tribe, where their chieftain, Cartamandua, she unfortunately was loyal to the Romans, and she betrayed Caratacus and handed him over. So poor old Caratacus was put in chains and taken to Rome. So normally what would happen is the emperor at the time was Claudius. He would have had a parade, and they'd normally get the defeated chieftain or leader, and they'd parade them through the city with all the captured treasures and whatever they wanted to show off. And then there would be a public execution, just to send a message out across the empire that if you lead a rebellion or if you stand against Rome, then you're going to be humiliated and murdered in terrible ways. But Caratacus's outcome was slightly different. He was paraded through the streets and he was brought before the Emperor Claudius. They fully expected, it was quite common that this would happen, so they fully expected Caratacus to beg for his life. But even then, Caratacus defied them. He gave a speech that had such an powerful effect that it shocked the Senate into sparing him. And so I'm going to read a little excerpt of what Tacitus wrote. And so this is Caratacus addressing the Senate. Had my moderation in prosperity been equal to my noble birth and fortune, I should have entered this city as a friend rather than a captive. But as it is, my misfortunes have been as great as your success. If you wish to command all, does it follow that all must accept slavery? Now that is an excerpt. That's not the full speech, I don't think, but that sort of encapsulates it. So instead of begging for his life was unheard of. But the Romans, being the Romans, they respect courage. And Caratacus's defiance impressed them so much that Claudius actually granted him his pardon, and he was allowed to live in Rome, where he, from this point on, he sort of disappears from history. But it is believed that he and his family lived out their lives as free Romans. So, yeah, Kathy, what do you think of Caratacus's speech?
Well, I'm just thinking about what it would have been like, him being brought, to Rome and to find out who this man actually was, because already he's built up quite a story, hasn't he? A narrative.
Yeah.
I wonder how much of a celebrity he was.
Oh, he was renowned. Yeah. Absolutely.
And so he doesn't like to lose, even when he's lost.
Competitive, isn't he?
Yeah, he's not going to admit that he's lost. Again, that's that defiance. But do you think if the story's gone before him, I suppose, do you think Claudius liked him?
No, well, that would be a difficult one to call because we were only presented with the imperial Claudius, not personal Claudius, right. What he was really like. I know that Rome, it was very particular about people defying the empire because one bad message could inspire a lot of bad messages to spread. So with people like him, like Caratacus, they do tend to have come to a grisly end, just to prove the point that Rome will destroy everything that just stands up against them.
So whether he liked him or not, they would have had to get rid of anybody. I suppose they got rid of each other, didn't they? If they didn't think they were safe in their ruling status, within the Romans themselves. Yeah. So the other thing was, I just wondering if he had a celebrity status, how much the people of Rome, the free people, how much influence they would have had, and how it was actually being such a celebrity and being such a big character, whether that actually was part of the reason that saved him.
Well, this is it. I mean, if he had natural gravitas and he had, if he was an appealing, inspirational character, he may well have been quite, a Celtic warrior is likely to have been fairly fit, fairly strong and fairly big. If he's out there and inspired tens of thousands of Britons to stand up against the irresistible might of the Roman Empire, at that point it was just you couldn't touch it. If it invaded, it took over. And if he was willing, if people were willing to follow him, then surely he was an inspirational leader. There was obviously something about him, and he would have been paraded through Rome, so the Roman public would have seen him. So maybe that, if he was an impressive sight, that may have had an effect. And of course, the Senate and the nobility, they wouldn't have, if it was in their benefit to slaughter him in a horrible way, they wouldn't have blinked. They'd have just got it done. So whether or not it was the impressive words or the way he delivered them or his demeanor, whatever it was, I certainly think that somebody who led a rebellion essentially for 10 years and then turned up on the streets of Rome and refused to bow his head and didn't beg for his life. I'm pretty confident that inspired respect, and it probably would have come from the top, because Claudius, all he had to do was do a cliche, lower his thumb. The Senate themselves had the power to execute him. He must have inspired respect at the very least to get that outcome.
Mm-hmm.
And not only that, he also, it's believed anyway, that he actually was, I think there was a quote that he was so impressed, Caratacus himself was so impressed with Rome, with the buildings, he couldn't wrap his head around why Rome was so bothered about their tents, the Celtic tents.
Yeah, so I suppose, he's potentially in awe of what Rome was as well.
Mutual respect, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely.
And he didn't recklessly attack Romans, he just assimilated into Rome in the end. So if that's another sign that he can change, he can pivot, he can,
Yeah, I just wonder how much he was able to pivot and think on his feet while he was under such pressure going up before Claudius. This is a life and death situation. So I wonder how much was really him being able to be very much on his game at those critical moments, like being in a very stressful, critical set of circumstances. He's been able to, I suppose, use his wit and his cleverness to think probably very quickly. I would imagine you have to read people really well to be able to deliver just exactly the right thing that's going to save your skin.
Yeah, exactly. I'm assuming that's what he intended, and he probably didn't want to die. But if you think about what he survived as well, I mean, he said foreign invaders come in, his family are dead, he can't possibly go back to where he was brought up, his inheritance, that's all gone, and he's spent 10 years trying to unify tribes that aren't natural allies. He's been fighting, he's been having to think strategically, probably not been able to relax. He can't settle down, and he's got to somehow try and fight the Romans off. Even if they can't shove them back out of Britain, they've got to find a way to try and keep their independence. He's lost that. He's defeated his friends, his allies, people who have been fighting with him for years. They're either dead or slaves or gone or whatever. And then he's had to run away from that. And then he's gone to who he hoped was an ally, and he's been betrayed. And then he's been put in chains and carted for weeks across Europe into Rome, where he's going to be faced with humiliation and eventual death, and he still just stood up in front of, face to face with the beast, right in there in the Senate, and stood his ground. Oh, what a guy.
But also, just if you think about how he wasn't one of those, it was very rare. Was he the only one who survived such fate?
No, others did survive. Definitely.
Okay.
Yeah, it's almost, if you reduce it down to a rebellious child in a classroom who doesn't want to learn how Macbeth died, and the teacher takes them to the headmaster's office, and the parents are called in, and they still stand their ground and say, no, I don't like it.
Yeah, and he's kind of saved his skin, but on his terms, isn't it, really?
Yeah, he kept his dignity, didn't he?
Yeah.
Well, what do you think then, Kathy? I mean, from everything we've talked about today, on a scale of 1 to on the spectrum, where do you think Caratacus sits on that? Do you think he shows enough neurodivergent traits for us to consider the possibility that he may have had ADHD and autism or anything else?
Yeah, the fact that he used so many traits to navigate what was a very difficult time in British kind of Roman history, that's just amazing. He's high up there, but just the fact that he got all the way through and still survived, that's amazing. The fact that he was a real survivor and was doing it by literally living on his wits, which is one of those things that you come across quite a lot in the neurodivergent community. So yes, definitely high up the scale, I would say. Again, somebody I'd love to meet. I'd be in awe of him, though.
He sort of smacks of those. I suppose it's an alien invasion in New York, and you've got the protagonist trying to sort everything out and keep his family alive and escape and do everything at once. It's impressive stuff. Definitely a hero. Right. Okay, so in conclusion, what do you guys think? Do you think Caratacus was neurodivergent? I mean, he was a brilliant strategist. He was able to think on his feet. He was able to adapt to new environments and lead people with sheer charisma. He rejected conformity. He resisted authority and refused to accept defeat, even when faced with overwhelming odds. So could these traits suggest an ADHD or autism? His ability to hyper-focus on a cause, his social adaptability, and his unpredictable tactics might hint at an ADHD brain at work. However, his refusal to mask, his rigid sense of justice, and his boldness in the face of power could be seen as traits of an autistic leader. Of course, we can't diagnose someone from 2,000 years ago, but it's fascinating to see how neurodivergent traits could have played a role in history's greatest rebels. So I'd love to hear what you guys think. Feel free to get in touch on Instagram. And that was Caratacus. So Kathy, thanks very much for joining us again.
Thank you.
All right, guys. Well, everyone take care, and we shall see you soon.
The Archaeology Podcast Network is 10 years old this year. Our executive producer is Ashley Airy, our social media coordinator is Matilda Siebrecht, and our chief editor is Rachel Roden. The Archaeology Podcast Network was co-founded by Chris Webster and Tristan Boyle in 2014 and is part of Cultural Media and DigTech LLC.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.